Have you ever been part of a team or, a project or even just a community where everything looked absolutely perfect on paper?
Oh, yeah, where the spreadsheets are all color-coded.
Right, exactly. The calendar is full, the goals are clearly defined, everyone has their assigned roles, but but the actual atmosphere in the room just felt viscerally, undeniably wrong.
Like you can just feel it the second you walk in the door.
Yes, you walk into a meeting and the air is just thick. And I'm talking about those situations where tensions are running incredibly high for absolutely no logical reason.
Right, and misunderstandings just seem to, like, multiply overnight.
Exactly. Conversations that should be incredibly simple become these tangled defensive webs. And everyone involved feels this unexplainable, bone-deep exhaustion, and nobody can put their finger on exactly why.
It is a deeply, deeply disorienting experience. And, the tragedy is that when people feel that inexplicable thickness in the room, they almost always start looking for a structural explanation.
Which is human nature. I mean,
Totally human nature. They assume it's a mechanical failure. They think, well, maybe our communication protocols are broken.
or we need to overhaul our project management software.
Exactly. Maybe the team is just burnt out and we need to schedule like an offset retreat or something. But the reality is they are attempting to solve a fundamentally invisible problem with highly visible mechanical tools.
Which brings up the core paradox we're tackling today for you, the listener. Why do we instinctively try to solve ghosts with spreadsheets?
It's a great question.
Right. So we are pulling today from an incredibly comprehensive manual titled Spiritual Warfare and Discernment in Ministry. And the mission of this deep dive is to really explore the hidden battlefield of leadership and service.
Because it is a battlefield.
It really is.
Hmm.
We're looking at why relying on organizational charts to fix spiritual erosion is just a guaranteed recipe for disaster, and ultimately how to master the actual art of discernment.
And I think to even begin to understand how that discernment works, we have to establish the foundational paradigm that this text operates on.
The core premise.
Right, the core premise, which is that ministry, kingdom work, or frankly, any truly meaningful redemptive service does not happen in a neutral environment.
It's never neutral.
Never. It happens in a contested space. The moment you decide to advance something of deep value, whether that's leading a church, building a healthy family, or, running an organization with actual integrity, you are stepping onto a battlefield.
And I want to make it clear to you, listening right now, that we aren't just talking about how to survive that conflict with your teeth gritted.
No, not at all.
The goal is leading through it with absolute clarity.
Yeah.
Because if you accept the premise that the space is contested, then you realize the visible problem sitting across from you at the boardroom table is rarely the real problem.
It's almost never the real problem. In fact, the text argues that the most dangerous mistake a leader can make isn't failure.
Right.
It's misdiagnosis.
Misdiagnosed. Okay, let's unpack this because I think of it like, well, if the check engine light comes on in your car, you don't try to fix it by changing the tires or getting a car wash.
Right, you'd look ridiculous doing that.
Exactly. You can make the exterior look incredibly shiny, but you have to diagnose the actual system that's failing.
And misdiagnosis is catastrophic because it leaves a team entirely vulnerable. In this context, misdiagnosis means looking at a profound, oppressive spiritual fatigue and treating it like ordinary busyness.
Like, oh, we just need more coffee.
Exactly, or treating a subtle spiritual attack that is actively fracturing a team's trust and treating it like a mere scheduling conflict. Or, a Myers-Briggs personality clash.
Oh, the personality tests. We love to blame those.
We really do. But when you apply a natural remedy to a supernatural ailment, the ailment simply metastasizes. It grows.
It's the difference between treating a symptom and treating the underlying disease. Like if a patient comes into the ER complaining of chest pain and the doctor says, wait, your skin looks a little pale, let's get you some bronzer.
That would be literal malpractice.
Right. You can make the exterior look perfectly healthy, but if the heart is failing, the patient is still going to collapse. If the problem is systemic and internal, all the exterior polishing in the world is just an exercise in delusion.
And the source material really grounds this internal systemic reality in a historical and biblical framework. It leans heavily on the Apostle Paul's letters, specifically Ephesians 6 and 2 Corinthians 10.
To insist that the Christian is not ultimately fighting against flesh and blood.
Yes. Paul is attempting to radically reorient the reader's perspective here. He's stripping away the illusion that our ultimate obstacles are the human beings annoying us in the moment.
Right, the person sending you the passive-aggressive email is not the actual enemy.
Exactly. The text insists that behind visible tensions lie invisible pressures, distortions, and oppositions that actively seek to deform the work being done.
Okay, let me pause there, because on the surface, that sounds incredibly heavy and, honestly, intimidating.
It does sound heavy.
But if you actually sit with it, it's profoundly liberating. I mean, think about the default psychology of anyone in leadership.
Oh, it's exhausting.
Right. If you are managing a team or raising a family, your natural reflex is to internalize every single ounce of friction.
Everything is your fault.
Yes. If two volunteers are at each other's throats, you immediately think, I've failed to communicate the vision. If the team's morale drops, you assume you're a toxic manager.
Exactly. And the text actively works to relieve that crushing, almost narcissistic burden of self-reliance.
Wow. Narcissistic burden. That's a good way to put it.
Because recognizing that opposition is a guaranteed feature of doing significant work means that conflict isn't necessarily an indictment of your leadership.
It's not just you messing up.
Right. It's often a sign that you are doing something that actually matters. The resistance isn't proof of your incompetence, it is proof of your location. You're trying to bring light into a room, and the darkness has a vested interest in pushing back.
But, and this is a big but, accepting that invisible spiritual battlefield introduces a massive variable.
It does.
Because the moment you introduce the concept of spiritual opposition, you open the door to some incredibly bizarre, damaging behavior.
Oh, we've all seen it.
We have.
Yeah.
How do we prevent this from devolving into outright paranoia? Because the text actually points out two major traps leaders fall into when interpreting conflict, right?
Yes. The source material identifies two opposing extremes that absolutely destroy organizational culture.
And those are?
Under-spiritualizing, which we can categorize as denial,
Right.
and over-spiritualizing, which manifests as hysteria.
Okay, let's wrestle with hysteria first, because I want to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If a leader starts blaming a missed email, a blown quarterly budget, or just a purely human disagreement on a demonic attack, that looks a lot like a very convenient evasion of accountability.
It certainly does.
Like if the projector doesn't work on Sunday morning because the tech guy literally forgot to plug it in, that's not the enemy. That's just someone forgetting the power cord. It feels like highly spiritualized language is often just a smokescreen for incompetence.
And the manual entirely supports that critique. That is the exact mechanism of the hysteria trap.
Oh, really?
Yes. When a leader spiritualizes every single inconvenience and frames every interpersonal friction as a cosmic battle, they create an atmosphere of immense fear and immaturity.
Because everything is so heavy.
Exactly. People no longer feel shepherded, they feel perpetually accused. It completely eradicates practical, moral responsibility.
Right. Because how do you argue with a spiritual attack?
You can't. You can't have an honest conversation about workflow or performance metrics in that environment. If an employee disagrees with the manager's strategy, they aren't just offering a differing professional opinion, they are suddenly framed as a tool of the adversary.
Which isolates the leader completely, because no one is going to offer constructive criticism if the penalty for doing so is being branded as a spiritual threat.
It creates an echo chamber of paranoia.
But then you have the pendulum swing to the exact opposite side, which is denial.
And denial is just as destructive, though it looks much cleaner on the surface.
So it's professional.
Very professional. Denial reduces all conflict to psychology, logistics, or personality types. It operates under the strict assumption that if we just find the perfect organizational chart,
Or implement the right communication software.
right, or have everyone take the Enneagram, all our problems will evaporate. The text argues this leaves a community completely unarmed.
Unarmed. Explain that a bit more.
Well, you are managing the visible symptoms, the bad communication, the chronic irritability, while completely ignoring the root system feeding those symptoms.
The source illustrates this with a really practical scenario about a conflict between volunteers, doesn't it? Let's dig into that, because it maps perfectly to office dynamics, too.
Yeah, it's a great example.
So imagine a minor conflict blows up between two people over a miscommunication about who is supposed to lock up the building.
Very standard issue.
Very standard. The hysterical leader jumps in and uses apocalyptic language, claiming the enemy is trying to destroy the foundation of the community through this scheduling conflict.
Right, making a mountain out of a molehill.
Exactly. Suddenly, the stakes are so artificially high that no one feels safe to just say, hey, I honestly just misread the spreadsheet.
While the denial-prone leader observes that exact same tension and completely ignores the relational fracture in the room,
They just look at the schedule.
yeah, they declare, clearly, our spreadsheet is confusing. We're migrating to a new app next week.
Just changing the tool.
They change the schedule, completely bypassing the fact that one of those individuals is now carrying a deep, unresolved bitterness that is quietly poisoning the team's trust.
So the alternative presented here is the discerning leader. But what is the actual mechanism of that discernment? How do they handle that exact same scenario?
A discerning leader possesses a sort of binocular vision.
Binocular vision, okay.
Yeah, they address the practical human failure directly and unapologetically. They say, yes, we dropped the ball on the schedule. We need a better system.
So they don't ignore the logistics.
No, they handle them. But internally, privately, they are acutely aware of the spiritual stakes. They are actively praying against the bitterness that wants to take root in that miscommunication.
They see both layers.
Exactly. They actively call the individuals back to relational unity. They recognize that human error is real, but spiritual opposition leverages human error to create division. They hold both realities in tension.
That makes a lot of sense for external conflict. But a massive portion of this text focuses on where that opposition actually originates.
And it's not where you'd think.
Right. It doesn't usually start with a dramatic, visible showdown. It starts somewhere much quieter and, honestly, far more dangerous. It starts in the mind.
The architecture of strongholds.
Yes, strongholds. The source does a deep dive into that famous passage in 2 Corinthians 10, which talks about the weapons of warfare being meant to destroy strongholds.
And it clarifies a crucial misconception here. We are not talking about Hollywood-style demonic possessions or supernatural manifestations.
Not spinning heads or floating beds.
Exactly, none of that. A stronghold, in this biblical context, is an entrenched, fortified pattern of thinking. It is a belief system that fundamentally resists the knowledge and the reality of God.
So how does a listener identify a stronghold in their own mind? Because from what I'm reading here, these strongholds are incredibly deceptive.
Very deceptive.
They don't announce themselves with ominous music. They don't look like evil desires. They actually disguise themselves as virtues.
This is perhaps the most penetrating psychological insight in the entire manual.
Oh, absolutely.
The opposition rarely attacks a leader by tempting them with a desire to do outright evil. That would be too obvious. A healthy leader would reject it immediately.
Right, if a thought says, go burn down the building, you know that's bad.
Exactly. Instead, the attack comes as a subtle distortion of something inherently good. Take, for example, the internal thought, I must hold everything together or this entire organization will fail.
On the surface, that just looks like an incredible work ethic. It looks like deep dedication and responsibility.
Exactly. It masquerades as virtue. But the text unpacks how that specific thought is actually a stronghold of self-reliance and deep-seated pride.
Wow.
It is a belief system that fundamentally resists the truth of God's sovereignty. It is the leader quietly declaring, God isn't sustaining this work. My sheer willpower is sustaining this work.
That is terrifyingly relatable. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening has felt that exact pressure.
Oh, 100%.
Or consider the thought, no one else understands the burden I'm carrying. I am completely alone in this.
Another classic one.
Again, in the middle of a brutal leadership season, that feels like a perfectly rational, realistic assessment of your situation. But it's actually a stronghold of isolation that actively resists the truth of God's presence.
And the text lists several of these, the perfectionism disguising itself as excellence, deep distrust and cynicism disguising themselves as discernment.
Right, we call it being realistic, but it's really just cynicism.
And the manual is very precise about the life cycle of how these strongholds actually form. It's a progression.
Walk us through that progression.
So a distorted thought, when entertained and repeated, becomes an assumption.
Okay.
An assumption, once it begins to govern your reactions, becomes a habit. A habit solidifies into a pattern of behavior. And a pattern, once it is structurally fortified against the truth, becomes a stronghold.
It's like pouring concrete.
Yes. It becomes the permanent, distorted lens through which you interpret every single interaction, every email, every conversation.
It really makes me think of an invisible, corrupted app running in the background of your smartphone.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. If you're looking at your screen, everything appears totally normal. You're opening your calendar, you're making calls, the interface looks fine.
But the phone is burning hot in your hand.
Exactly. In the background, this corrupted code is running in a constant loop, taxing the processor, draining your battery from 100% to 0 in 2 hours.
And you can't figure out why.
You never actually see the app on your home screen, but you are experiencing the catastrophic symptom.
Yeah.
You're constantly, inexplicably exhausted. These internal strongholds do the exact same thing to our spiritual and emotional energy.
They just run in the background.
Yes, draining our capacity for grace.
That analogy perfectly captures the unseen mechanism of exhaustion. And because these internal strongholds deplete our energy and our clarity, they leave us highly vulnerable to the next phase of the attack.
Which brings us to a major shift in the text's focus.
Right.
Because when the external pressure finally comes, it almost never looks like an explosion. It operates through the strategy of gradual erosion.
Gradual erosion. The text argues that the most effective strategy against a community or a leader isn't spectacular, visible destruction.
It's subtle.
Very subtle opposition. The goal isn't to get you to loudly deny your faith or dramatically burn down your organization overnight. The goal is simply to introduce a tiny bit of distortion.
Just a few degrees of drift.
Exactly, to create just a few degrees of drift over time.
The mechanics of this are fascinating, and the manual breaks down the specific tactics used. The first is the deployment of half-truths.
Which are so dangerous.
A half-truth is infinitely more lethal than a complete outright lie, because a half-truth contains just enough reality to bypass your critical thinking,
Right, it sneaks past the guards.
but enough distortion to completely derail you. Take the internal whisper, "You are not doing enough. You should be further along by now."
Oh, that's a heavy one.
There is usually a kernel of truth there, right?
No.
Everyone has room for growth. But if that thought is being driven by constant comparison to the perceived success of others, rather than a genuine conviction about your own calling, it ceases to be motivating and becomes a paralyzing distortion.
Comparison is such a brutal metric.
It really is.
And the text points out that comparison shifts the entire reference point of your identity. Instead of looking vertically at what you've been called to do, you look horizontally at everyone else.
Checking everyone else's land.
Exactly. And it creates a no-win scenario in the brain. If you look at someone and feel superior, it breeds toxic pride and complacency.
Right.
If you look at them and feel inferior, it breeds crushing discouragement and resentment. Either way, your actual work grinds to a halt.
Another primary tactic the text emphasizes is fatigue. We touched on this with a corrupted app analogy, but the manual takes it further. It says exhaustion profoundly weakens discernment.
It absolutely does.
When your central nervous system is completely fried, every minor inconvenience is interpreted by the brain as a massive existential threat.
You lose all sense of proportion.
You really do.
This is why the author stresses that rest, specifically the biblical concept of Sabbath, is not a luxury, a wellness trend, or like a lifestyle suggestion.
Yeah.
It is a literal weapon of spiritual warfare.
Okay, stop right there, because we really need to unpack that.
Yeah.
Sabbath as a weapon of warfare sounds like a complete oxymoron.
It does sound strange at first.
How does taking a nap constitute warfare?
Because true Sabbath isn't just about catching up on sleep. It is a violent, intentional act of defiance against the stronghold of self-reliance and the empire of productivity.
A violent act of defiance.
Yes. When a leader forces themselves to completely cease their labor for 24 hours, they are physically living out the terrifying reality that the universe continues to function without their management.
They're dethroning themselves.
Precisely. It is an active declaration that God is God and they are merely human. That act of aggressive resting starves the stronghold of pride of its oxygen.
Wow. Okay, that entirely reframes rest from like bubble bath self-care to structural defense.
Exactly. It's armor.
But there's another tactic of erosion here that might be the most common of all. Unresolved defense.
The silent killer of communities.
Exactly. I want to look at the mechanics of this because it's so common. Think about how concrete spalling works in architecture.
Oh, interesting.
A massive, seemingly impenetrable concrete pillar can hold up a bridge for decades. But if a microscopic crack forms and a tiny drop of water gets inside and reaches the steel rebar, that rebar begins to rust.
And when it rusts, it expands.
Yes. As it rusts, it expands, creating immense internal pressure until it eventually blows the solid concrete apart from the inside out.
That's a perfect visual for it.
Unresolved defense works the exact same way. It's a tiny, misunderstood comment in a staff meeting. Instead of addressing it, you bury it.
You just swallow it.
Right. And that buried offense ferments into suspicion. That suspicion acts like rust, it expands. It begins to shape how you interpret the next email that person sends.
And the next one.
Exactly. Eventually, that tiny seed of unaddressed friction blows the entire relationship apart from the inside.
And the terrifying part is how totally ordinary it feels while it's happening. The structural integrity is compromised long before the visible collapse.
So true.
So the manual offers a diagnostic tool. How does a leader, or how do you, the listener, actually detect this slow drift before the concrete explodes?
Right. How do you catch the rust?
The text says you have to become an expert at reading the atmosphere. You have to monitor the subtle, qualitative shifts in a room.
What does that look like?
You watch for the moment when vibrant devotion slowly calcifies into mechanical dryness, when clear, charitable communication begins to muddy into passive-aggressive confusion.
Just a change in the tone.
Exactly. When a team that used to eagerly collaborate suddenly feels like a room full of quiet, guarded rivals. You measure the erosion by paying attention to the evaporation of joy.
Man, the evaporation of joy. That is a chilling metric.
It's the canary in the coal mine.
So to combat that kind of insidious erosion, a vague sense of intuition isn't going to cut it. The text outlines that a leader must cultivate 3 highly specific, structured layers of discernment.
It operates almost like a defense-in-depth strategy.
And it starts with the absolute bedrock, doctrinal discernment, guarding the core.
Doctrinal discernment is defined as the rigorous ability to recognize truth and accurately identify error.
It's the foundation.
It is. It's rooted in the biblical mandate to test everything. And the author provides a stark warning here. False teaching, or theological distortion, rarely arrives wearing a neon sign that says, "Hello, I am a heresy."
Right. It doesn't look evil.
Not at all. It does not present itself as evil. It presents itself as enlightenment. And it operates through 3 very subtle, distinct maneuvers.
What are the mechanics of those maneuvers? Like, how does an idea get distorted without setting off our alarm bells?
First, it distorts by stripping context.
Okay, stripping context.
It takes a legitimate text or a beautiful truth out of its proper historical biblical context and bends it to serve an entirely modern alien agenda.
Just cherry picking.
Exactly. Second, it omits. It tells only the palatable half of the story.
The easy stuff.
Right. It will loudly preach the beauty of God's grace, but entirely omit the absolute necessity of human repentance. It preaches love, but completely softens or erases any concept of divine holiness or justice.
And the third maneuver.
Third, it misplaces emphasis. It might use all the correct, orthodox vocabulary, but it shifts the center of gravity. It makes human flourishing, self-actualization, and personal success the center of the universe, rather than divine glory.
This feels incredibly relevant right now, especially considering the media landscape we live in.
Oh, it's everywhere.
You can scroll through a feed or listen to a charismatic speaker, and their message sounds incredibly positive. It's uplifting, it uses all the right Christian buzzwords, and it makes you feel deeply validated.
It feels good to hear.
Right. So how does someone lacking a formal theological degree spot that a message is actually omitting the core truth and slipping into a dangerous man-centered distortion?
The manual provides a profound countermeasure for that. It argues that the gospel cannot be reduced to a therapeutic message of self-improvement.
It's not just a self-help seminar.
No, it's not. True doctrinal discernment means knowing the genuine article so intimately, so deeply, that the counterfeit feels immediately, instinctively out of place. It requires a leader to internalize the grand, sweeping storyline of Scripture: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration.
So it's about having a complete map, rather than just knowing a few isolated landmarks.
Precisely. If your entire theology consists of a handful of comforting, disconnected verses, you are incredibly easy to manipulate.
Because you don't know the terrain.
Exactly. Anyone can quote a verse out of context to justify a selfish decision. But if you have the whole map integrated into your mind, you instantly recognize when someone's teaching is leading you off the edge of a cliff, regardless of how scenic the view looks in the moment.
You realize the map doesn't match the road.
Right. You recognize that elevating human comfort over God's authority breaks the foundational logic of the entire map.
But having a flawless theological map doesn't solve everything, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Because you can be 100% doctrinally accurate. You can have all your systematic theology perfectly aligned. And you could still absolutely destroy a team if you misread the human beings you are leading.
That happens all the time.
Which transitions us from guarding the message to interpreting the messengers. The second layer of defense here is relational discernment.
And this is arguably the most complex and difficult form of discernment to practice.
Why is that?
Because human beings are walking contradictions, relational discernment is the capacity to perceive what people actually mean, not just what they say. It is the sober, mature understanding that human motives are rarely pure. They are deeply complex, layered, and almost always mixed.
The text highlights a particularly toxic dynamic here, which is the use of spiritual language as a shield to hide bad behavior.
Oh, this is so common.
It gives the example of a team member who constantly says, I just have a huge heart for unity in this group.
Sounds great.
Right. But if you have relational discernment, you start to perceive that their definition of unity actually means absolute compliance.
They just want you to agree with them.
Exactly. What they're really communicating is, I am terrified of conflict, and I do not want my ideas to be challenged.
Or consider the person who constantly blasts people with harsh criticism and excuses it by saying, I am just speaking the prophetic truth. I'm just being bold for the gospel.
Using truth as a weapon.
Yes. When in reality, if you look beneath the surface, they are simply using religious language as a pious excuse to vent their own unresolved anger.
And to avoid taking any responsibility for their cruel, unloving tone.
Exactly. And if a leader lacks relational discernment, they will take those words at face value and allow deeply toxic, manipulative behavior to hide behind a mask of piety.
It really requires a kind of psychological X-ray vision.
That's exactly what it is.
You have to be able to see past the skin and muscle right down to the broken bone. But I want to be careful here, because having X-ray vision can quickly turn you into a deeply cynical person.
It's a huge risk.
The goal of having that X-ray vision must be to act like a surgeon, to carefully, precisely heal the patient. The goal is not to act like a judge, pointing at the X-ray, publicly condemning the person for having a broken arm, and just walking away.
Right, you don't just point out the break.
You diagnose the break so you can set it and restore the limb's function.
That distinction between the surgeon and the judge is exactly what the manual emphasizes, and it points directly to Jesus as the ultimate model of this relational discernment.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
The text examines a fascinating, really intense interaction between Jesus and the Apostle Peter. Jesus is explaining that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer, and be killed.
He's laying out the mission.
Right. And Peter, operating out of sincere, fierce human affection, rebukes him. He says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Peter loves Jesus. He is trying to protect his friend.
And Jesus' response is, well, jarring.
Very jarring.
He turns to his closest friend and says, "Get behind me, Satan," which, to our modern ears, sounds like the most abusive, toxic leadership response imaginable.
It sounds entirely disproportionate until you analyze it through the specific lens of relational discernment.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Jesus possessed the flawless ability to distinguish between the human being and the underlying influence. He discerned that the force animating Peter's words was not just misguided affection. It was a direct demonic attempt to divert him from the mission of the cross.
He heard the real voice behind the words.
Yes. Jesus recognized the voice of the adversary using the vocal cords of his friend. So he violently, unconditionally rejected the message and the influence, addressing it directly as Satan. But, and this is the hinge of the entire concept, he did not reject Peter.
That's huge.
He didn't excommunicate him. He didn't fire him from the team. He separated the man from the manipulation.
He rejected the lie, but retained the relationship, which is proven later, after the resurrection, when Jesus gently cooks Peter breakfast on the beach and asks him, "Do you love me?" to carefully heal Peter's underlying wounds of denial.
Exactly. And this interaction perfectly illustrates a crucial question the text addresses head-on: the difference between discernment and cynicism.
Let's define that difference.
Cynicism is a defense mechanism. It expects the worst in everyone, it assumes all motives are manipulative, and it fundamentally closes the heart to protect itself.
It's self-preservation.
Right. Discernment, however, is sober and realistic. It expects human complexity. It fully acknowledges that people are fallen and easily influenced, but it deliberately keeps the heart open in order to love people truthfully.
Doesn't shut down.
Exactly. It is the incredibly difficult work of holding charity and clarity together in the exact same breath.
So let's say a leader has developed this. You have doctrinal discernment, you know the truth of the matter. And you have relational discernment, you have the X-ray vision to know what is actually happening in a team member's heart.
You're pretty well equipped.
You would think that's enough. But knowing what is happening and why it's happening is completely useless if you don't know when to open your mouth.
Timing.
Which introduces the third and perhaps most frustrating layer, situational discernment. The wisdom of timing.
Situational discernment is defined by the text as the spirit-trained wisdom to recognize exactly what a specific moment requires, when to move, when to speak, and most agonizingly, when to wait.
And I think this is where the text violently collides with modern corporate culture.
Oh, completely head on.
We live in an ecosystem that aggressively financially rewards speed. Instant reactions, rapid deployment, the whole move fast and break things philosophy.
Silicon Valley's favorite motto.
Right. If you see a problem in your organization, the mandate is to fix it immediately. Decisiveness is worshipped. Why does this manual argue so strongly against urgency?
Because the manual recognizes a profound psychological reality. Urgency is rarely birthed from wisdom.
Wow.
More often than not, urgency is driven by fear, by an inflated sense of pride, or simply by a leader's own internal inability to tolerate the discomfort of unresolved tension.
The tension's just too awkward.
Exactly. When a leader is purely reactive, they move too fast, they make decisions without full situational clarity, they speak harsh words out of an anxiety to regain control.
And then what happens?
Then they inevitably spend the next 6 months doing damage control, trying to repair the relational carnage their haste caused.
So the speed was actually just a mechanism to relieve their own internal anxiety, not an actual strategy to solve the problem.
Precisely. And the manual argues that biblical waiting is not passive stagnation. It is not ignoring a problem hoping it magically goes away.
It's not burying your head in the sand.
No. Biblical waiting is alert, expectant, and fiercely prayerful. It is the discipline of holding the tension before God until the correct strategic moment emerges.
The biblical examples the text uses to illustrate this are staggering, particularly when you look at the psychological toll of that waiting. Take David.
A perfect example.
The text points out that David was literally anointed as the rightful king by the prophet Samuel. He had the divine mandate, but he didn't instantly storm the palace and stage a coup.
Not at all.
He spent years living as a fugitive in the wilderness, hiding in literal caves, enduring profound injustice and obscurity.
And we really have to recognize the mechanics of what was happening in those caves. David had moments where his oppressor, King Saul, was incredibly vulnerable.
He could have ended it in a second.
Exactly. David's own men were whispering in his ear, urging him to strike, telling him this was his God-given opportunity to take the throne. The urgency to seize control must have been overwhelming.
The peer pressure alone.
But David possessed situational discernment. He understood that taking a shortcut to the throne through violence would compromise the very character required to sustain his rule once he got there. He refused to force God's hand.
He knew that how you arrive at the destination dictates what you are capable of doing once you get there.
That's exactly it.
And the text shows this pattern everywhere. Moses lacked situational discernment early on, right? He saw the oppression of his people, acted on his own urgent, furious timeline, murdered an Egyptian, and bought himself 4 decades of exile in the desert.
A very costly reaction.
But then Esther, on the other hand, is a masterclass in timing. Her people were facing literal genocide. The urgency could not have been higher.
Literal life and death.
But she didn't rush into the king's throne room in a panic. She fasted, she waited, she orchestrated a series of banquets, and she delivered her request at the exact, psychologically perfect moment.
And again, the text points to Jesus as the ultimate embodiment of this. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus is constantly pressured by his family, his disciples, and the crowds to act, to perform, to prove himself immediately.
Everyone wanted a miracle right then.
Right. And his recurring response is, "My hour has not yet come." He operated entirely flawlessly on the Father's timetable. He was completely immune to the frantic, urgent demands of the culture around him.
It's as if he possessed an internal metronome that was synced perfectly to heaven, completely drowning out the ticking clocks of the anxiety-driven world.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
But as I read this, I have to ask, are there exceptions? Because waiting can sometimes be a dereliction of duty. Surely there are moments when a leader must abandon the waiting and act instantly.
Yes, absolutely. The manual is very nuanced here. It carves out explicit, necessary exceptions to the rule of waiting.
What are they?
Immediate, decisive confrontation is absolutely required when a delay would permit active, ongoing harm. If a toxic falsehood is rapidly spreading that will permanently damage a community's foundation, or if a vulnerable person is being abused, exploited, or marginalized, a leader has a moral mandate to step in immediately.
You do not wait and pray while someone is actively bleeding.
Exactly. You apply the tourniquet. But the text argues that for the vast majority of ordinary relational friction, strategic decisions, and cultural tensions, leaders must carry the matter in prayer until the timing is fully ripe.
Okay, so we have the complete framework now. Doctrinal discernment to guard the truth, relational discernment to understand the heart, and situational discernment to master the timing.
That's the triad.
But as the manual moves toward its conclusion, it makes a very sobering pivot. Applying all these layers requires an immense amount of internal fortitude.
It really does.
A leader cannot simply memorize these concepts, slap them on like a tool belt, and walk into a boardroom. They have to be internally prepared before they ever encounter the opposition.
Right. The real battle is internal.
Which brings us to the final and honestly most intimate section, the inner life of the warrior servant.
This is where the text gets intensely personal. It makes the argument that all Christian warfare, all leadership, all discernment begins in the private soul of the one who serves.
In private.
Yes, it issues a stark warning. Public authority is exponentially easier to maintain than private holiness.
Oof.
It is terrifyingly easy to have the impressive title, the platform, the microphone, and the perfectly managed spreadsheets. But if your inner life is hollow, you are simply a casualty waiting to happen. The structural collapse is inevitable.
To prevent that collapse, the text introduces a concept that I think is the most practical takeaway of the entire manual. It calls it preemptive faithfulness, or the discipline of the meeting before the meeting.
And we really need to explain the actual mechanism of how this works.
Let's do it.
Let's look at it practically. Preemptive faithfulness means that a leader does not walk into a tense, high-stakes conflict resolution meeting cold.
You don't just wing it.
Right. You don't just review your notes and walk in. You enter that physical room, having already spent time in private, confessing your own pride and your own desperate desire to win the argument. You enter having already actively grounded your identity securely in your calling and in Scripture.
And what does that actually do? How does that change the dynamic of the meeting?
It radically alters the leader's internal neurobiology and spiritual posture.
Really? Neurobiology?
Yes. If your ego has already been dismantled in private prayer, then when someone levels a harsh, unfair criticism at you during the meeting, it doesn't trigger your amygdala's fight or flight response.
You don't get hijacked by your own brain.
Exactly. You don't feel the desperate, defensive need to justify yourself because your identity wasn't resting on their approval to begin with.
Yeah.
You can respond to their anger with genuine curiosity rather than defensive escalation.
That's incredible.
The battle for the culture of that room was actually won in the quiet moments before the public interaction ever occurred.
But if a leader skips that step, if they are too busy to have the meeting before the meeting, the text warns about a creeping, insidious condition it calls numbness.
Numbness.
And this feels like an absolute epidemic in modern leadership. A leader can become so continuously exposed to the hum of organizational stress, the endless barrage of emails, and chronic interpersonal conflict that they simply stop feeling the spiritual weight of anything.
Well, we'll just go on autopilot.
They build up a callus, and the danger is they confuse their high-level administrative competence with actual spiritual vitality.
That is the ultimate deception right there. They're running entirely on fumes.
But it looks like they're flying?
Right, because they still know how to chair a meeting, balance a budget, and deliver a compelling presentation. They assume the engine is fine. They don't realize the car is just rolling down the hill on momentum, and the engine died miles ago.
Which perfectly encapsulates the overarching unifying theme of this entire manual, which is that true ministry, true redemptive leadership, is cruciform.
Yes, cruciform, meaning it is fundamentally shaped like the cross.
What does that mean for a leader, practically?
It represents a paradigm of downward mobility in leadership. It requires the constant, agonizing, daily laying down of the ego, the reputation, and the desperate human need to be right and to be recognized.
The strongest leaders, according to this completely inverted paradigm, are not the ones with the loudest voices in the room.
They rarely are.
They aren't the alpha personalities who never show weakness, never tremble, and never admit fault. The absolute strongest leaders are the ones who know exactly where to kneel.
They fight from a posture of profound surrender. They understand that the ultimate battle is fought from a place of victory that has already been secured by Christ.
It's already won.
Right. Their leadership is not a frantic, anxious, exhausting scramble for control over a chaotic universe. It is the quiet discipline of standing firm in a reality that is already true.
So, after dissecting this massive manual, what does this all mean for you listening right now? Let's synthesize the journey we've been on together.
It's been a lot of ground covered.
It has. True discernment is not about becoming a cynical detective,
Well,
endlessly suspicious of the motives of everyone on your team or in your family.
no, that's just paranoia.
Right. It is about becoming steady. It is the practice of love with its eyes wide open. It is the mature, sober recognition that the bizarre friction you feel in your office, your church, or your home is very often a spiritual reality masquerading as a logistical problem.
And you have to treat it accordingly.
Exactly. And a spiritual reality demands a spiritual response, a response that is deeply rooted in doctrinal truth, governed by incredibly wise timing and completely saturated in relational grace.
It really is the paradigm shift from reacting to your circumstances out of anxiety and fear to responding to your circumstances out of anchored historical wisdom.
It's beautifully said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you step back into whatever environment you lead.
Oh, this is a good one.
The source material makes a passing observation that resistance almost always intensifies specifically around work of deep redemptive value.
It's like a magnet for opposition.
Right. The enemy doesn't waste artillery on empty fields. So think about this. What if the very area of your life, your project, or your relationships where you are experiencing the most confusing, relentless, exhausting friction right now is not a sign that you have failed?
That's such a comforting thought.
What if it isn't a sign that your leadership is inadequate or that you've taken a wrong turn?
What if that intense resistance is actually the ultimate confirmation that the ground you are standing on is highly significant?
What if that exact painful friction is the proof that you are operating in the exact territory you are meant to reclaim? Don't let the resistance convince you to retreat into denial or panic into hysteria.
Stand firm.
Let the resistance make you steady. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious, keep your eyes open, and we'll catch you next time.